We put it on speaker view, so it's less obnoxious when you're watching it. Okay, so the fall in human nature. So Origen, like I said last time, he believed that he thought of God as a mind, not as, he didn't believe God had emotions because God didn't have a body in his mind. This is all, if I say some things that sound heretical to you, it's not me saying them, it's Origen. I'm telling you what Origen thought. So he didn't believe God had a body. He didn't believe God was necessarily emotional at all, that God had emotion. He believed God was a mind. And so with that, with thinking of God as a mind, we can, from there, sort of talk about his ideas of human nature. Because everything flows from this idea of that we are created to sort of, in some way, emulate God, which is right, and be in fellowship with God, which means that we weren't created to have a body, which means that we weren't created to be physical beings, that we were created to be souls. So a little bit of Gnosticism, some of the same stuff you might see in modern evangelicalism as well, that the whole goal is to sort of get away and fly away. But that is not Orthodox Christianity in the least bit. So here's something more controversial about his views of the fall in humanity. He always thought of human beings the same way that he thought of God. He rejects the idea that humans are intrinsically embodied physical beings. He believes that human beings are mainly a soul having a bodily experience. It's the kind of thing you'll hear, I guess, honestly, I've heard Rob Bell kind of talk like this. I don't think he realizes how enmeshed a little bit of his thinking is in sort of Plato and the Gnostics. But I've heard him quote Origen as well. So Origen rejected the idea that human beings are again, embodied beings. He believed in Plato's teachings that humans are just temporary containers for eternal disembodied immaterial souls. Right on cue, yard work starts outside. Right on cue, every time. Chainsaws buzzing. And so he believed that when the body dies, the soul survives and it flies away. And he didn't even stop there. He went so far as to like point out stuff in the other direction. He basically believed that human beings had always existed, had always been souls, that the human beings didn't start, a person didn't start at birth, that they existed before that. He believed that they'd always lived, that they were previously existing as pure minds united to God. So souls at one point existed free of bodies and in complete bliss, and there came a moment when, for some reason, he argues that they abandoned their existence, their spiritual existence, and they fell away from God. In a sense, they sort of, I guess, for some reason made a decision that, like, we're going to try something different. And all the beings that were not God sort of fell. And as they fell, their pure intellectual existence became really sullied. Because for him, the highest thing you could be is an intellectual, because God is a mind. Therefore, God is intellect and intelligence, and all-knowing is like sort of the best way he would describe God. So the more you knew, the more godly you were. So he was heavy on intellectualism, very elitist. And so he believed that at the fall, though, our sort of existence, our intellectual existence was sullied. And as a result, we have what we see today, where our actions are no longer driven purely by intellect, but they're swayed by our emotions and our physical desires. That part of our fall is separating ourselves from our intellect and being led by emotion. And that's what makes us imperfect. So God's response to the fall is to create physical beings for these souls, these sullied souls, to dwell in. So he creates humanity out of necessity of his salvation plan, like to catch the souls of human beings, right? Like, this is wild stuff. And so that's his response to the fall. And so God places our newly emotional souls into these bodies, and he places us on earth. God creates the world because we have to have, not only have bodies, we have to have a place to go, to breathe, to eat, all this. So God creates everything out of necessity and puts us there. And he believes that this explains our physical existence, explains how we are to live, that we are to be striving to be driven not by our passions, but by our intellect. And that one day we will be free of our physical passions. And the more godly you are, the less you are led by them. And so the idea of living sort of as a monk would be a high ideal for him. You're rejecting physical passions and physical desires and emotions just to study God. Now, if you guys have at any point like any questions or anything, I'm gonna put the chat window over here on another screen so I can see if you're typing them in, or you can just hop up and say, "Hey, Tommy," and then call them out. So the question arises when you're reading about this stuff: why, though? Why did the souls fall? Origen at one point argues that it was caused by free will, and free will is a central doctrine of Origen, and he believes that we freely chose to abandon God. That he believes that beings chose this to differing degrees. Okay, so he argues that the reason there are different levels of personhood, sort of like angels down up top, and then demons down at the bottom, and then the devil way below them, and then humans in the middle, is because of the nature of the fall. He says some fell further than others, but all of those three categories were at one point united with God and equals. So he believes that some fell a little bit and they became angels. Some fell really, really far and became demons. One fell farther than all the rest and became the devil. And then those in the middle, us, became humans. We didn't fall all the way. We just sort of fell a little way, okay? And so this is basically, honestly, a mirror image of Gnosticism. The Gnostics taught that the world came into existence at the fall, not before, but at the fall. And they believe that we are trapped in this world, yearning to sort of return to a higher realm. And so you can see the influence of Gnosticism that runs parallel to Origen. And the difference is that Origen didn't believe that the material world was evil. He believed that God created it as part of his good plan. That when God says he looks at it and says, "This is good." Like, it's sort of the first proclamation that, like, okay, step one, good job, good for me. We're getting this done. We're moving forward. So as you can see, he has this bizarre view of creation. And people ask, like, okay, well, why would anyone ever need to know that? Why did we save the teachings of Origen? Why do you teach them? Okay. The main reason that I think you need to understand people like Origen and Tertullian and Irenaeus is so that you can see that what you believe today is not always what was believed, not even especially among the church fathers. That your view of Genesis, possibly, that it may be a hill that you choose to die upon, that a lot of Christians do. And their interpretations of Genesis, they believe they trace these things all the way back to the Old Testament. And the fact is, that couldn't be farther from the truth, that as you read through church history, very few of these men are actually taking the creation narrative literally. They're all taking the creation narrative in their day from popular thought in their day. So it is not at all offensive in the line of church history to listen to scientists who tell us how the earth got here. If Origen is listening to the scientists of his day, if you will, I mean, science was only invented 600 years ago, but in his day, the deep thinkers were the Gnostics, the Platonists, Aristotelian scholars, and the Jewish scholars and the Christian scholars. In his day, these were the professionals, and so this is where you went. In our day, we've progressed far beyond these things, and so we go to these places today. So the whole point of that is, I don't at all even remotely believe anything he believed about his creation narrative. However, I think it's important to understand that he had one that was not a literal reading of Genesis, and that, in fact, all the church fathers did, including Augustine. Nobody wants to admit that. And Calvin. I have a Calvin Genesis commentary right over there. He didn't take it literally either. Him and Luther were both humanists, Christian humanists, who believed it was perfectly fine to engage in these kind of things. Okay, so that's his view of the fall and human nature. So it's sort of complicated, but it's understandable. You can wrap your mind around it. Now, let's go to Christ and salvation, because these things all build off each other. You can see that his understanding of the human situation is different than probably yours. So his salvation narrative is also going to be different because he believes the problem is not necessarily the same problem that you might see it as. His problem, for him, in his mind, the problem God is going to solve is much different. So Christ and salvation. There was, in Origen's mind, a single soul that remained faithful and united to God. One single soul remained united to God. Guess which soul that was? Jesus Christ. And so let me read you a quote from him in his book On First Principles. This is chapter 2, verse 6, and the subtitle is 6 as well. So he says this. He says, "Supposed a lump of iron is placed for a time in the fire. It takes on the fire through all of its pores and veins and becomes completely changed into fire. As long as the fire is never removed from it, and it is never removed from the fire, in this way then, that soul which, like a piece of iron in the fire, was forever placed in the Word, forever in the wisdom, forever in God, is God in all its acts and feelings and thoughts." So he pictures basically a piece of metal in the fire. You watch it and it lights up, it turns red, and it's part of that. But when you remove it, it starts to cool and harden and become something else. But as long as it's connected to the heat source, the source of power, it remains exactly the same substance and appearance and being that the fire around it and the coals and all that are. And he says, this is how the soul is to God. The soul that is connected to God in this way, as long as it stays close and in the fire, it is God in all its acts and feelings and thoughts. And this is how he describes Jesus, the one soul who never turned away. Okay, so his view of Jesus is obviously rooted in his view of the cosmos and the fall. So he's explaining Christ, and a lot of church fathers focused on a human Christ that was animated and sustained by the Logos, the Word, by God. And so you picture in a lot of the other church fathers a body which is sustained, sort of, I want to say like a marionette, if you will, sustained and animated and controlled by God. But Origen, so in other words, like their idea is that that God is sort of keeping this thing going. Origen's difference from them, where he separates from them, is that Origen thinks the soul is an essential component of Christ, that Christ had a soul, that is an essential understanding of how you should grasp Christ, because it's what gives Jesus his humanity. It's what mediates between God and Christ's body, that the soul of Christ was united with God even in his human body, and that's what makes him different. And our bodies were not united with Christ. So as crazy as all of that is, it was a starting point for the later church, for what they believed about it being essential for Jesus to have a soul, because a soul is required in order to be fully human. This was not necessarily believed before Origen. People never thought about it. That one of his big arguments is that, like, what makes Jesus fully human is that he has a soul. And to be honest, before reading Origen, I literally never thought about that, ever. But I do think it would be wrong to say that he doesn't. And the only reason I think that is because Origen brought it up and made me think about it. Another reason is important. So, in order to depict Jesus as an animated body, like the other church fathers might have, that God simply dwelled in instead of a human with a soul, that would be considered heretical by the later Christians because of Origen. So in regards to salvation, though, so that's Christ. What about salvation? For salvation, Origen doesn't have a clear doctrine of the role of Christ's role in this whole thing. He actually believes that all of creation plays a role in our salvation in the same way that it captures your body, it holds it, and it facilitates sort of your sanctification. He believed that all of creation was working towards your salvation, and Christ was one ingredient in that, but not the sole actor in it. So like Irenaeus, Origen believed that the universe was created as a place in which we could better ourselves, in which we live here, and while we are here, we can actually become better people. A lot of, it's not hard to actually look at a lot of modern theologies that push back against that and say, no, totally depraved. You cannot become better. And this is another reason that a lot of Western thinkers reject everything that Origen ever said, is because he believed you could actually contribute to your own sanctification and become more Christ-like throughout your life on your own effort. He didn't believe that God could just restore people because that would override free will. Instead, he believed that we have to get there ourselves by the exercise of that free will that caused us to fall in the first place. So we're fighting against what brought us here, in other words. So the world basically becomes a training ground for your soul. The world is a giant gym for your soul to work out in. It's where we fail. It's where we learn to succeed, where we continue to be sanctified. And here's a quote. He says, it lies with us and with our actions whether we are to be blessed and holy or whether through sloth and negligence we are to turn away from blessedness into wickedness and loss. So he warns people against slothfulness. He warns people against being lazy. He warns people against living the easy life. He thinks every moment of the day should be spent either being productive or in prayer or loving people as God loved, but most importantly, studying. And so lastly, he believed that you couldn't really do this in one lifetime. This is where it gets really crazy. You couldn't do this in one lifetime, which is why last time we talked about his cosmology, he believed that the world, the universe is cyclical, that it goes, it ends, and it restarts again, and it ends, and it restarts again. But he believed it different from the Gnostics, who believed that the universe replayed and was identical every single time. That everything that has been done, that everything that is done now has already been done and will be done again. Origen breaks from them and says, no. This is all part of your redemption. You are born, you live, you die, you are reborn in the new universe, and you die. And it just goes around and around, and every time you are working towards your consummation with God, closer and closer you edge towards this thing. And so for those who are lost in sin, and who did not progress, he believed that life became hell on earth. Not only that, he actually did believe, despite what you may have heard, he actually did believe that hell was waiting for people afterwards, people who did not progress. He believed that hell was waiting for them afterwards, but he did believe that the punishment of hell is not retributive for their crimes. Instead, he believed that it was a remedy for their sickness. In other words, he believed that punishment had a reason. A lot of Christians don't believe this. A lot of Christians believe that, I think the general understanding today is that that punishment, that like things like hell or whatever are simply, hold on, I got a weird thing going on here, are a weird, I'm sorry. Okay, so where was I? Modern Christians today kind of believe that things like hell is simply punishment. You did something wrong, you're going to suffer. But they don't believe that it could actually, that it ends, that it has any purpose other than making you feel pain. In Origen's day, punishment was viewed always as a process. It was meant to purify you, to teach you. And so he believed that punishment is always intended for our good, and that eventually it cleanses you and it ends once you've endured it. And so he believed that hell is temporary. He didn't believe it was eternal. He believed that all creatures would eventually be restored. This is where it got controversial. Let me read you on First Principles, chapter 2, 10:3. It says this: there is a resurrection of the dead, and there is punishment, but not everlasting. For when the body is punished, hold on, I have a weird translation. For when the body is punished, it is gradually purified, and so it is restored to its ancient ranks. For all men and for demons too, punishment has an end, and both wicked men and demons shall be restored to their former rank. So he believed not only would everyone eventually be saved, but the demons would eventually be saved, because of course he believed that we all came from the same substance, and the angels, people, and demons, and the devil all came from one, and so we all fell, and so we would all be brought back together. And so the question was asked, that obviously pops up in your brain, so you think the devil's going to be saved? And he didn't directly answer the question, but according to his theology, yes, of course. And it was this doctrine of salvation and of the devil that got Origen in a lot of trouble in his own lifetime. But it didn't get him declared a heretic. It just made a lot of people mad at him. It's not clear, and let me clarify that. The reason it didn't get him labeled a heretic is because heresy has specifically to do, again, with Trinitarian theology, how you explain the Godhead, and Christology, how is Jesus both God and humanity in one, what we call a hypostatic union. That is where heresy lies. Outside of there, it's discussion. But if you violate those, you're violating the creeds, which puts you outside of the church. And so his doctrine of salvation got him in a lot of trouble, got him a lot of pushback. It's not clear how explicitly he held this idea, but when it was finally challenged, he kind of did deny indirectly that the devil would certainly be saved. He kind of left room for it, arguing that it was merely possible. On the other hand, the doctrine of universal salvation does follow, it has to follow from his claim that God punishes his creatures only in order to improve them. And then in the end, it will be like the beginning, because he believed everything goes in cycles and eventually everything will be made whole. So the end will be like the beginning. And he asked the question, if at the end of all things, and this is a valid question that we have to deal with in every generation. If we believe, as most Christians do, that the end of all things will be like it was at the beginning, that the end of the text will be like the beginning of the text, that God intends to restore. If we believe that, and if at the end of all things, God did not restore everything to its original perfection and union with God, what would that say about God's power and God's wisdom? And what of Paul's claim in 1 Corinthians 15:28 that says, after the last enemy, death has been conquered, God will be all in all? And Origen points to this. And he says, if your God isn't going to save everything, what's the use of your God? How powerful is your God if he can't redeem everything? If there will be casualties and some are lost. And so for Origen, this doesn't violate free will because it's a process in which you choose, in which you suffer, and then you choose not to suffer again, and you choose to work better. So like, he's got a whole thing. He's got a whole system, but it all fits within a weird package of cosmology and anthropology. It's super weird. But some of his questions are valid and should be answered. So there's that. By the way, he's not the only church father that was a universalist in this way. This is sort of a process universalism. Gregory of Nyssa did, what's the guy's name? Pseudo-Dionysus, another great church leader. They all built off of him as well. The mystics, a couple of the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nyssa is one of them. They believe this as well, that punishment has a purpose, that it's not just torture. My dog's afraid of the thunder, and so he's hiding under me. So, resurrection, let's go there. Resurrection, if in the end everything will really be like the beginning, then it would seem that the entire point of everything is that we would end up bodiless again as souls. And that's what makes sense if you actually believe what he believed. But that's not actually where he ended up regarding the resurrection, which is really weird. He's not always consistent. To start off, he builds off of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 about how what is sown as a physical body will be raised up as a spiritual body. So he says, once you receive that body, there's really no going back. Like, you will have some sort of body, some sort of container. You will never be like God again, but you can be with God. And so Origen doesn't really believe that these new bodies we receive will be literal flesh and blood bodies like we have now. And to be honest with you, growing up in evangelicalism and Southern Baptist traditions, that's not far from what I believed growing up. It's not what I believe now, but I kind of believed like, no, it's a glorified body. Well, that's Origen. People don't realize how influenced they are by people that they would declare heretics. If they're a heretic, reject all their ideas at the same time. And so now he basically taught that, like, what we understand is that he taught that they would be some sort of like angel bodies. Now, again, this is also familiar to me. In fact, there are a lot of evangelicals who think this way, that when you die, you would come back as angels. And I always hear pastors deprogramming this out of people, saying like, no, when you die, you don't become an angel. But why do people keep thinking that? Because your belief structure lends itself to this natural thought that you become an angel. If you're becoming a disembodied soul then receiving a glorified body, sounds like an angel to me. A few years back, there was a boy who wrote a book about how he went to heaven and had wings and stuff. And he basically says that he became an angel. I think the kid's last name was Malarkey, which is perfect because it later was revealed that he made the whole thing up. And his books were yanked from the shelves, but it didn't matter. He already made all the money. So we have a question here. It says, what would you say, this is from Matt, what would you say this idea of eternal regeneration of the soul, having the opportunity to sanctify itself over time, is similar to reincarnation? Was it inspired at all by possible interactions with the East? Well, yes, he was an Eastern father, first off, but he was not. Reincarnation, you'd have to sort of slightly redefine it as, like, because modern reincarnation today is you die and you're reborn, like you progress up the food chain. You get worse, you become a bear, or maybe that's better. You know what I mean? Like, or you become a bacteria if you're real bad. But this is that everything is cyclical, and that I guess you're progressing towards your union with God. There's elements of it, I guess, but it's not technically reincarnation.
Maybe a cyclical purgatory almost?
That's purgatory necessitates the punishments, so like a person who does pretty good on their first life wouldn't end up in purgatory. So it's like its own thing. It's hard to really describe it outside of Origen. I know we kind of like, we want to know what it is so we can put it in a box and better understand it, but maybe you just need to say like, oh, it's just Origen. He's his own dude. And so, yeah, we don't know exactly what he believed for sure about these glorified bodies that you receive. He probably wrote about it, but again, he wrote 6,000, like we know of 6,000 texts that were all burned because 300 years after his death, his followers were declared heretics and they gathered up all the stuff and burned it. So we have like 8 texts. So we don't have a lot to work with, but we do know that he was later heavily criticized for his views of resurrection, because people were arguing that is no resurrection at all. That is not the hope that the Israelites, that the Jewish people believed in. I think he's way off as well. He was accused of denying the resurrection of the dead, basically. And all of that combined with his views of pre-existing souls, cyclical existence of life to life, all of that eventually drew enough attention to his followers in the 6th century that made everybody look up and say, holy cow, what was this guy teaching? And so they declared his followers, they declared Origenism a heresy. But here's the kicker. What the Origenists were teaching seems to be a lot farther than where Origen would have gone. And so Origen himself was never condemned as a heretic. He was fought back against. He was rebuked a bunch of times, but his followers were declared heretics, and his later incarnations of his teachings were, if that makes sense. And so that's what got his books burned. And that's what made it so hard to piece them all back together from Greek and Greek fragments from his enemies writing against him and quoting him. So we're like, oh, look, a quote, grab that, put that with the other quotes, and let's build what we can. And some Latin texts and stuff like that. Very little of what he had survived. So, spiritual life. That's that. Let's talk about spiritual life for him. For Origen, the Christian life consisted of doing our best to overcome our bodily passions, like I already said. There is, and I say this a lot, everything that Origen kind of teaches, you can see small strains of this in modern theology. There is a large strain of this in modern theology, particularly in the purity movement, that tells you to not live by the flesh, and it takes an Origenist understanding of it instead of a Pauline understanding, which they think is Pauline, but I would argue the new perspective on Paul, which is a new model of thought come up in the last 50 years, has proved that that is not Pauline theology. So the idea that the Christian life consists of purging your body of sin, that's pretty heavy in evangelicalism, and that's pretty heavy in Origen, but it was not very heavy in the early Pauline thought. So he also believed that you should stay as far away from sin as humanly possible. Now, all of that I agree with, but I don't believe that it makes you pure. The goal of Christianity is not purity. Jesus is never called pure one time. He's called holy a bunch. Being holy and being pure are two different things. And what modern theology does, it takes holy and pure, puts them together. Purity had to do with whether or not you could enter the temple. So purity culture itself starts off on a weird footing. Like the premise that it launches off from is that God will reject you and not let you enter into communion. And that's just simply not true if you're impure. Origen believed that you should immerse yourself every day in scripture reading. I agree with him there. I think you should. I think we should exegete the text constantly, and I think it would save us from all kinds of problems that we today find ourselves in. If we truly were seeking to understand the early church and their mindset, not just memorization, not just doing what they did, understand why they were doing what they did, exegeting the text, if you would. And so he believed that you should engage in doctrinal pursuits, intellectual pursuits, and he believed not only that, he believed that the intellectual and the spiritual were the same thing, that if you want to be a spiritual person, engage in intellectual activity. And the more intellectual you are, the more spiritual you are. These things are the same. They are synonymous. As one grows, the other does as well. Today, they've broken off of this, and there seems to be in evangelicalism in the West a anti-intellectualism, to where the more you study and the more you learn about the universe, the less spiritual you tend to become. And the more you reject all of that in scientific findings and such, and you just believe things that whether or not they have evidence, whether or not they are good arguments, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. That is the opposite. So they're grabbing some Origen and they're throwing some out. And again, he believed these were the same thing. To read a book and to understand something new is to become more godly. Here's what he says. Here's a direct quote. We see that human beings have a kind of blood relationship with God. And since God knows all things, it is possible that a rational mind also, by advancing from a knowledge of small to a knowledge of greater things, and from things visible to things invisible, may achieve an increasingly perfect understanding. So he believes the more you understand, the more godly you are. The more you know, the more godly you are. I'm trying to figure out whether or not I agree with this. I think I might. I think it is a godly thing to understand God's world. I think it's a godly thing to do science. I think they're doing God's work. And I think they're teaching us things that we need to know that help us better engage in our vocation and calling of being the idols of God here, the images of God. So to an extent, I would say I do. I'd have to think deeply about whether or not I could really embrace all that. So most importantly in his eyes was that there was 3 books in particular that you should study. These are the books of wisdom, the books of Solomon. So 3 of them: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So Proverbs, he says, teaches us how to live correctly. Okay. Ecclesiastes, he believes, teaches us about the world around us, how it functions, how we should view it. And the Song of Solomon teaches us how to come close to God, draw close to God, and have intimacy with God. So he takes it as obviously allegory, because this is how he interprets every word of the Bible, as an allegory for something else. And so the union between the man and the woman in the sexual union between them in the Song of Solomon is, in his mind, the entanglement of humanity, the human souls, the mingling of divine and human souls that we find in a relationship with God. And so that's what he first and foremost told his people to study, which I think is crazy, because I would argue you should only study first off and understand first off the things of Christ before you go to these other things and read them through Christ. So in all of this, Origen is really the first great Christian mystic. All the mystics that would come after him, Gregory of Nyssa, Pseudo-Dionysius, they would build off of his views on what he thought, what he believed, what he taught, and his views of the mystical union with Jesus. And so, yeah, that's his idea of the spiritual life. So that's it. We talked about his fall of human nature. We talked about Christ and salvation. We talked about resurrection and spiritual life. So I'm going to end here, and then we can have some Q&A if you want, or you could just go eat your lunch. His main contributions. Let me recap real quick. I'm going to name 3 of them that I think are probably his main contributions. First off is the Hexapla, that writing that he made where he was the first one to engage in biblical criticism, where he took hexapla, hex means 6, right? 6, yeah. And he lays out the Hebrew Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek copied Old Testament, and then I believe, I forget, I have it written up there. Hold on. Hexapla. Okay, so it is the Hebrew, the Septuagint, and then 4 rabbinical interpretations of the text. And he laid them all side by side. And he looks at basically the similarities and the differences between them. He compared them all to learn about them and find out basically where they differed, and show you how you can find the earliest text, the earliest one, amongst a whole stack of them. And so we use this to this day when we find papyrus in the Middle East buried in the sand. You pull it out and you read it, and you lay out all the other texts. If it's like a copy of the book of Matthew, you lay it out next to all the other copies of Matthew, and you compare it, and you quickly can weed out all the later dates, and you can work back to say it's identical to this one. So we know it's at least this old. He's the first one to do this and to teach us this. So this is like stuff we still use to this day. So the Hexapla, I think, is his biggest contribution. His second biggest contribution, I would say, is Trinitarian thought. His Trinitarian thought and his way of thinking about this led precisely to our current understanding of the Godhead. His intellectual pursuits as part of the faith journey, that was not a part of our faith either until him, really. But I think his Trinitarian thought is probably the most important, because he talks about the Son being eternally begotten of the Father, not just born once, but eternally being born. And that is, whether you've ever heard that, that is Orthodox Christian teaching. It's in the creeds. And then you have the Spirit who emanates from the Father as well. So the Father is begetting and emanating the Son and the Spirit, because God is a creator, and he is always creating. And so if God is at some point no longer begetting and emanating, then God ceases to be the creator. But it is, according to the text, one of the primary descriptors of who God is, a creator, always creating. So yeah, there's that. And by the way, that's some fun stuff to talk about too, and maybe sometime. I think as we move forward in church history, we will eventually have to deal with the 7 ecumenical councils where they debated Trinitarian thought and Christology, and it gets fascinating. So the last thing I think that is his main contribution is allegorical interpretation. It opened us up to the idea that there are very, very many ways to read the Bible, not just one. It instilled in our mind the fact that people have done this before him, and people can keep doing this. The rabbis were always doing this, and he sort of made this mainstream thought again, that there are deeper ways to interpret things than just the surface level. So yeah, those are his main contributions: the Hexapla, Trinitarian thought, allegorical interpretation, and coming in at a close fourth would be his intellectual pursuits and his encouragement that Christians should engage in intellectual pursuit. So that is Origen. Hopefully you understand, and hopefully you respect him a little more. If you were raised being told, he's terrible, don't ever read him, that's somebody who doesn't understand how much stuff they actually inherited from Origen. Thoughts, questions, ponders, pushbacks, anything at all? What do you got?
Thanks for doing this, sir. I appreciate it. I'm kind of a somewhat new Christian, and I have a lot of questions. I'm imbibing a whole multiplicity of thoughts and theology and getting whiplash in doing so. And yeah, I need some traction.
Need book recommendations at all?
From you? Should I?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're just getting used to the Bible, my professor wrote a book called The Blue Parakeet. And it's brilliant. His name is Scott McKnight, The Blue Parakeet. And it's sort of it'll talk to you about how to read the Bible. It starts off slow on purpose, so keep pushing through and slowly read it and pick up on it. If you want to engage in church history, there's a book. I don't have the dust jacket for it, but it's called The First 1,000 Years. This will take you from Paul up until 1,000. It'll take you through all the church fathers and tell you how they fit. And it's brilliant. It's a really fun read, honestly. I mean, for me, not for everybody. But you'll learn about like how churches started getting property and buying land. You'll learn about like a lot of places where they did terrible things and had to repent. It's awesome. And it starts right in the middle of the Bible. So that.
Thank you. Yeah. I going through a lot of the podcasts of the sermons. I'm just picking up so many books and authors, and I really appreciate everything you've been doing and
Awesome.
how God is moving through this church. I used to be like a real postmodernist and not really believe in truth. So it's kind of difficult for me to hear a lot of different, you're talking about allegorical interpretations and versus literal, and how some people might view his interpretations as heresy. What is heresy, that kind of thing. You were saying in the last Church for Lunch, this is neither wrong nor right, and that's what makes it interesting, which I agree with, but that's what also makes it very frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my teachers, he's teaching Discovering the Bible, and he's a strict literalist, thinking in Genesis the first 6 days are 24-hour days. And I kind of cringe when I hear it, but I don't know he's wrong. And there's all this subjectivity going on. I tend to believe more in John Walton's cosmic temple kind of
John
thing.
Walton is far beyond, I think, the authority right now in that topic.
Okay.
He's brilliant. His books, The Lost World of, like Lost World of Adam, Lost World of Genesis, Lost World of the Flood, brilliant. So those topics are great, well covered by him. I would say literal readings of Genesis, the earth is 6,000 years old, or 6 or 10 or whatever. That stuff is all brand new in church history. It is not how people used to view things, as I just showed you. So yeah, there's not, Christians have for the most of their history been in conversation with the thought leaders of the world. Like when someone finds out the earth is round or that it rotates around the sun, Christians are usually right there, but the people fighting against it are the people in power in the church. And so that's where the rub comes. God is always working at the bottom, as just like in the Bible itself. God is always working at the bottom, and the people at the top end up working against God, because when something changes, they tend to lose all their power, influence, and money. And entire institutions come down. And so they declare Galileo a heretic, right, and lock him up. So the Bible literally talks several times about how the earth is flat. It talks about how the sky is a solid dome firmament. And the reason it says these things is because that was thought of the day. They weren't scientists. They didn't know how we got here. They're not blindly like in a trance writing and then surprised at what they read. Like they're arguing about who God is as God has been revealed to them, and they're using what they understand to tell the story. So Walton does a great job of all that.
Thank you. Yeah, with all this multiplicity of perspectives, I kind of worry that it's okay to be wrong, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I worry that I have the wrong belief, and you have the wrong belief, you'll act in the wrong way. And I kind of get bent up on maybe I have it all completely wrong and I'm missing something. I don't know. I'm afraid
So
of it.
I don't think the pursuit is rightness. I don't think that's what we're in search of as Christians. It's not to be right. It's to be Christ-like. So like, it's more understand Christian thought throughout the ages, so you can get a grasp of like sort of the boundaries and the borders. The creeds are vital. That's why they exist, to draw those sort of boundaries and borders. But within that, there is grace, there is arguments, all kinds of stuff. And the goal of all of it is not to be right, it's to be Christ-like. So Augustine said, if you read the text and it does not make you more loving of people and God, then you have interpreted it wrong. And I think Augustine's right when he says that. Now, that's a summary. I don't remember the exact wording he used, but that's what he said. If you read the text and you interpret it in a way that makes you less loving and less loving of both people and God, you're wrong. Rethink that.
All right. Thank you very much. I was reading
Yeah.
Confessions today, actually, and the difference between Augustine and Origen. Augustine was talking about how it's better to know God. He was talking about all the understanding of science and knowledge. Acquiring these things means nothing without the love of God. Do you think Origen, when he was talking about intellectual pursuits, that they had to be related to God?
No,
Okay.
not at all. If you learn
All right.
about gravity, you're becoming more godlike because God knows about gravity. Right? Like,
All right.
so every little thing you learn makes you more like God in his mind.
All right.
And I
Thank you
don't
so much.
necessarily disagree with that. Like,
Yeah.
that's hard to disagree with. Like, yeah, you learn something new. You're open to more ways of moving throughout God's world. So sure, whatever.
Okay. Thank you.
I really like that perspective. Sorry, I don't have my camera on
It's all
because
good.
I'm kind of I'm at work secretly watching.
Oh man.
But I like that perspective because so often I find myself reading posts online or hearing arguments from peers who either have no faith or are questioning faith, and they'll say there is no God because they discovered atoms, and I'm like, just because you saw something and named it didn't make you the authority or the creator of it. And I'm like, why does that not resonate with people who claim to be intellectual? How can you take intellectual, or how can you claim, I guess, or how can you, devalue the idea that this was created or designed just because you gave a name to it, as if it wouldn't have existed unless you saw it. It just bothers me to all end.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so Dr. Fauci, his boss is I think it's Sir Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, an evangelical Christian. He's written many books about
Awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's brilliant. So like
BioLogos, right?
Yeah, BioLogos, his website is brilliant. Deborah Haarsma works there too, and I think Pete Enns. I think my own professor Scott McKnight was a part of it. Still is a part of it as well. And they're not messing around with intellect. Like, they're a powerhouse. So, yeah, we're on the cutting edge of all the sciences. So, yeah, it's something we should engage in. We should do. Yeah. Oh, and so Matt, also your comment on how you used to be a postmodernist. I think we all kind of went through that. I was part of the emergent church movement in the early 2000s. I asked too many questions and kind of got pushed out. So I have noticed, and I would call it that there's this weird evangelical postmodernism today, where there is no truth once again on their end. The thing they always warned us of is that there'd be a people who wouldn't believe in truth. And that's why so many of them are falling into this Q conspiracy nonsense, because there is no truth. Everyone's lying to you. And if you raise an entire generation to not trust science and intellect and scientists, there will be no basis of truth for anything. And everything that fits your personal narrative will become your truth. And so we end up with evangelical postmodernism. It's a brand new thing. I want to write about more of it. I've been thinking a lot about it. And yep, I agree with what you said there. Yeah. So that's that. Any final thoughts?
I have one last question, then I got to run back to work.
Yeah, what you got?
So I recently have been reading Richard Rohr's book, and I don't know if you've been reading anything on Richard Rohr, because it's really interesting to hear the perspective of a Catholic priest's observations on the church and where we're heading as a church. And in his book, he's openly talking about the absolute requirement for Reformation in the church, and that was appropriate. And the Reformations have happened, and now he's looking and preaching a message of, all right, now how do we get back to a church again, to one church again? And he talks quite a bit about the church fathers and the mystics and how we've evolved to what we've become to. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on Richard Rohr, if you've read him at all.
I have. I've read some of his books. I read Falling Upward. I read Cosmic Christ, stuff like that. I think my main issue with Richard Rohr is his understanding is he's got a very limited understanding of first century Palestinian Judaism. And so when he talks about Christ, he literally, and I hate this phrase, but he literally culturally appropriates that term from the Jewish people and applies it across the board to enlightened human thought. So the Christ in the Jewish early, like all it meant the Davidic king. That's all it could be. That's all it is when it's mentioned in the Bible. And he applies it across a wide range of thought, and ripping it out of sort of its own context and applying it to other places. And I think the reason he does this is because he graduated from, I think he may have been a seminary. I think is he Franciscan or is he Jesuit? I don't remember.
Franciscan, I believe. Yeah, I think it's
okay.
Franciscan.
So he graduated back in the 70s, before a lot of the things that we engage with today in academics, like the New Perspective on Paul, for instance. A lot of that stuff came out 15, 20 years after he graduated. A lot of work has been done in Christian thought in the last 40 years. Like, it's been insane. A lot of new understandings that is overturning. Basically, we found out that Luther and Calvin were both wildly wrong about what Judaism actually was, and that led to a misunderstanding of justification, all kinds of stuff. But all that to say, I think Richard Rohr missed the boat. I think I wish he had stayed in school a few more years, stuff like that. Like, I think he could have brought so much more to the table, and I think he missed out. Yes, he's right, we need another Reformation. But I don't think he understands what the early church actually looked like, because he didn't keep learning. But I appreciate his thoughts.
He comes from a very, very Catholic, organized Catholic perspective, and it's very evident. But I did enjoy his points, which are aligning really closely with some of your Acts sermons. I'm also reading. I'm listening. I'm trying to catch up. So I've started as far back as I can, and I'm listening up. And I really like his emphasis on social justice for Christians.
Yes.
And so I found him attractive from the ideas he brought to the table, which I think is what kept me going and interested in what you're talking about, which is almost like a countercultural Western Christian way of thinking, which is interesting. I like it. Absolutely.
Good thoughts.
Thanks.
Right on. Hey, I got to take off. I got to go record a sermon at the church. It's fake Sunday. So I'll see you guys later. And I don't know what we're going to study yet in 2 weeks, but I'll pick something and I'll post it up there, and you can read ahead if you want. But
I'll take fake communion with you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Take it easy.
Bye, everyone.